My husband cheated on me, but the real twist came when I found out who he was with. Hey Reddit, I'm Emily, 35, and I've been married to my husband, Jake, 38, for 10 years. We met in college, fell in love quickly, and have been through thick and thin together, or so I thought. I've always believed in our marriage, but a few months ago, I found out that Jake was cheating on me. It was the worst pain I'd ever felt, but what hurt even more was discovering the identity of the person he was cheating with. My whole world fell apart, and I'm still trying to figure out how to pick up the pieces. Here's the story of how I found out, what happened next, and the unexpected twist that changed everything. Jake and I met when I was 20, during my junior year of college. I was still figuring out who I was and what I wanted to do with my life, but I was ambitious, excited, and hopeful for the future. Jake, who was 24, was in his final year of college, and he was everything I thought I wanted: charming, confident, and with a smile that could light up a room. We met at a house party thrown by a mutual friend, the kind of chaotic college gathering where everyone was squeezed into a cramped living room, red Solo cups in hand, shouting over the loud music. I noticed Jake almost immediately. He was leaning against the kitchen counter, laughing with a group of friends, and I was drawn to him like a magnet. It wasn't just his looks, though I'd be lying if I said that wasn't part of it, but it was the way he seemed so at ease, effortlessly commanding the attention of everyone around him. We locked eyes from across the room, and before I knew it, he was making his way over, introducing himself with a confident smile. We talked for hours that night, finding a quieter corner where we could actually hear each other over the noise. He told me about his dreams of working in finance, of climbing the corporate ladder and making a name for himself. I told him about my love of writing, how I dreamed of one day becoming an author. We bonded over our shared love of travel, our favorite movies, and our mutual disdain for early morning classes. By the end of the night, I felt like I'd known him forever. Jake asked for my number before we left, and I remember feeling a rush of excitement as I handed him my phone. Over the next few weeks, we started seeing each other regularly: coffee dates, late-night walks around campus, and movie marathons in his tiny apartment. Jake was everything I wanted in a partner: kind, attentive, and always making me laugh. He had this way of making me feel like the most important person in the world, and I quickly fell head over heels for him. Within a year, we were living together in a tiny off-campus apartment. We were young, broke, and crazy in love. I was still finishing my degree in English, working part-time at a bookstore to make ends meet, while Jake had already landed a job as a junior analyst at a financial firm downtown. Our lives were hectic, but we made it work. We'd spend late nights talking about our future, dreaming of the day when we'd have enough money to travel the world, start our own business, or maybe even write a book together. Jake was ambitious, always pushing himself to do better, to work harder, and I admired his drive. He'd wake up at the crack of dawn, dressed in a crisp suit, ready to tackle whatever the day threw at him. I loved how motivated he was, how he always seemed to have a plan. But as Jake's career began to take off, I noticed that his focus started to shift. He was spending more and more time at work, often coming home late and exhausted. I tried to be understanding. I knew how important his job was to him, but I couldn't help but feel a growing distance between us. We got engaged shortly after I graduated, and a year later, we were married in a small, intimate ceremony at a charming little garden near our hometown. It was a beautiful day, filled with love, laughter, and the promise of a bright future. Jake's mom cried happy tears as we exchanged vows, and my dad gave a toast that had everyone in stitches. It felt like the start of our happily ever after. We moved into a modest townhouse in a quiet neighborhood, and for the first few years, life was good. Jake continued to climb the corporate ladder, landing promotions and bonuses that allowed us to live comfortably. We took vacations to Europe, hosted dinner parties with friends, and were the picture-perfect couple on social media. I started working as a freelance writer, spending my days crafting articles and stories while Jake was at the office. From the outside, we had it all: a beautiful home, successful careers, and a love that everyone envied. But as Jake's career grew, so did the demands on his time. He was working longer hours, often missing dinners or important events because of last-minute meetings. He was constantly on his phone, checking emails and taking calls even during our time together. I tried to be patient, telling myself that this was just a phase, that once Jake settled into his new role, things would go back to normal. But the longer it went on, the more I felt like I was living with a stranger. Our conversations became stilted, more about logistics, what bills needed to be paid, whose turn it was to buy groceries, than about us. Jake was distant, less affectionate, and I couldn't remember the last time we'd had a real, meaningful conversation. I missed the man who used to dance with me in the kitchen, who'd surprise me with handwritten notes and spontaneous weekend getaways. I tried to reignite the spark by planning date nights, cooking his favorite meals, and even suggesting couples therapy, but Jake brushed it off, insisting that he was just stressed from work. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that the man I married was still there, somewhere beneath the surface. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I could feel it in the way Jake avoided my touch, in the way he'd pull away when I tried to talk about our future. It was like we were living in two separate worlds, and I didn't know how to bridge the gap. The first real red flag came one Friday night, about 6 months ago. Jake told me he'd be working late again, which had become a regular occurrence. I was used to eating dinner alone, scrolling through social media while I waited for Jake to come home. But that night, I decided to surprise him by bringing him dinner at the office. I figured it might be a nice way to show him that I still cared, that I was still in this with him, even if things felt off. I packed up his favorite pasta dish, drove downtown, and made my way up to his office. The building was quiet, the hum of fluorescent lights buzzing in the empty hallways. But when I got to Jake's floor, his desk was empty. His computer was off, and the lights were dim. I asked one of his co-workers if they'd seen him, and they gave me a puzzled look. Jake left around 6, they said, glancing at the clock. It was almost 8 now. My heart sank, and I tried to hide the confusion on my face. I thanked them and left, my mind racing with questions. Where was Jake? Why would he lie about working late? I drove home in a daze, replaying the night over and over in my head. I tried to call Jake, but it went straight to voicemail. When he finally came home around 10, he looked surprised to see me still up. "You're up late," he said casually, tossing his keys on the counter. I asked him how his day was, trying to keep my voice steady, but my stomach was in knots. He mumbled something about a crazy day, kissed me on the cheek, and went straight to the shower. I wanted to confront him, to ask him where he'd really been, but I didn't know how to start. I had no proof, just a gut feeling that something wasn't right. Over the next few weeks, Jake's behavior grew more suspicious. He was glued to his phone, always texting or taking calls in another room. He'd get defensive when I asked him simple questions about his day, and he started making excuses to avoid spending time together. I felt like I was losing him, but I didn't know how to fix it. I started to doubt myself, wondering if I was just being paranoid, if maybe I was overreacting. But the feeling that something was wrong only grew stronger. Then one night, while Jake was in the shower, his phone buzzed with a text. Normally, I wouldn't have looked. I'd always respected his privacy, but something compelled me to pick it up. The message was from someone named Rachel, and it read, "Can't wait to see you again. Last night was amazing." My heart stopped. I stared at the screen, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. Who was Rachel? And what had happened last night? My hands shaking, I scrolled through their messages, each one a knife to the heart. There were flirty texts, inside jokes, and plans to meet up that Jake had clearly hidden from me. They talked about meeting at hotels, sneaking away during work hours, and even making plans for a weekend getaway. It was obvious that this wasn't just a casual friendship, it was an affair. I felt sick, angry, and completely blindsided. This was the man I'd built my life with, the man who'd promised to love me forever, and he was cheating on me. When Jake came out of the shower, I confronted him, holding up his phone with the damning messages. He went pale, his eyes wide with panic. He tried to deny it at first, stumbling over his words, saying it was just a misunderstanding, that Rachel was just a friend. But the evidence was undeniable. Finally, he admitted that he'd been seeing Rachel for months. He insisted it meant nothing, that it was just a fling, and that he'd never meant to hurt me. But his words felt hollow, and I couldn't believe a single one of them. I was devastated. The betrayal cut deeper than anything I'd ever experienced. I felt humiliated, angry, and completely shattered. I kicked Jake out of the house that night, needing space to figure out what to do next. He begged me to forgive him, to give him another chance, but I couldn't even look at him. The man I loved and trusted had betrayed me in the worst way, and I didn't know how to move forward. Update number 1: the fallout and trying to move on. After Jake moved out, I went through every emotion imaginable: anger, sadness, confusion, and overwhelming grief. I'd always prided myself on being strong and independent, but this shattered me in ways I never expected. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw Jake's face, heard his voice begging for forgiveness. It was like I was living in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. The days blurred together, each one feeling heavier than the last. I'd wake up every morning with a pit in my stomach, the reality of Jake's betrayal hitting me all over again. I couldn't concentrate on anything. I'd find myself staring at my computer screen for hours, unable to string together a coherent sentence. My writing, which had always been my escape, felt impossible. I'd start a sentence, then delete it, over and over, until I finally gave up. My friends and family were supportive, but I felt embarrassed to tell them the truth. I'd spent years talking about how perfect my marriage was, how lucky I was to have Jake. Now, admitting that he'd been unfaithful felt like admitting that my entire life was a lie. My mom, who adored Jake, was in shock. "I can't believe he'd do this," she said, her voice thick with disbelief. "He always seemed so devoted to you." I tried to keep up appearances, smiling and pretending that I was fine, but inside, I was falling apart. I stopped answering phone calls, canceling plans with friends because I couldn't bear to face the pity in their eyes. I'd lie in bed for hours, replaying every moment of my relationship with Jake, wondering where things had gone wrong, wondering if there was something I could have done differently. Jake, meanwhile, was relentless in his attempts to win me back. He sent flowers, wrote long apology letters, and even showed up at my work unannounced, begging me to talk to him. He promised that he'd cut things off with Rachel, that he'd do anything to make it right. But every time I saw him, all I could think about was the betrayal. I didn't know if I could ever trust him again. I started therapy, hoping it would help me process everything. My therapist, Dr. Collins, was a kind, soft-spoken woman who made me feel safe enough to unload all the pain and anger I'd been carrying. She encouraged me to focus on myself, to take things one day at a time and not feel pressured to make any big decisions. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," she said gently during one of our sessions. "It's okay to just feel what you're feeling." I threw myself into work, trying to keep my mind off Jake and the mess he'd made of our lives. I took on extra projects, stayed late at the office, and filled my weekends with friends and activities that kept me busy. But no matter how hard I tried to distract myself, the hurt was always there, just beneath the surface. I'd catch myself staring at old photos of Jake and me, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. One day, about a month after Jake moved out, I ran into Rachel at a coffee shop. I'd seen her picture on Jake's phone: blonde, tall, and effortlessly beautiful. She looked like the kind of woman who had it all together, and seeing her in person was a gut punch I wasn't prepared for. I was waiting in line, trying to decide between a latte and a chai tea, when I glanced up and saw her sitting at a table by the window. Our eyes met, and for a moment, we just stared at each other, the tension thick and suffocating. I didn't know what I was going to say, but before I could speak, Rachel stood up and walked over. "Emily, right?" she said, her voice surprisingly soft. "Can we talk?" I was stunned. This was the woman who'd wrecked my marriage, who'd been sneaking around with my husband behind my back, and now she wanted to talk? Part of me wanted to tell her to go to hell, but another part of me was desperate for answers. I nodded reluctantly, and we sat down at a small table in the corner. Rachel looked nervous, fidgeting with her coffee cup. "I didn't know Jake was married when we first started seeing each other," she said, her voice trembling. "He never wore a ring, and he never talked about you. I found out by accident, and when I confronted him, he swore you were separated. I know that doesn't make it right, but I just thought you should know." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt a twisted mix of anger, pity, and disbelief. Jake had not only betrayed me but had been lying to Rachel too. It was like his web of lies was bigger than I'd ever imagined. I asked Rachel why she'd stayed with him once she found out the truth, and she just shrugged, looking down. "I thought he'd leave you for me. I guess I was wrong." I left the coffee shop feeling even more confused than before. Rachel wasn't the villain I'd built up in my mind, she was just another victim of Jake's lies. It didn't excuse what she'd done, but it made me realize that the person I needed to confront wasn't her. It was Jake. After my encounter with Rachel, I knew I needed to confront Jake. I needed answers that only he could give me, and I couldn't move forward without understanding why he'd done this. I texted him, telling him that I was willing to talk but only if he was honest. He agreed, and we met at a quiet cafe where we wouldn't be interrupted. Jake looked different, tired, worn down, like the weight of his actions was finally catching up to him. He apologized again, his voice thick with emotion, but I was past the point of accepting empty words. "I need to know why, Jake," I said, my voice shaking. "Why did you do this? Was I not enough for you?" Jake looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of guilt and sadness. "It was never about you, Em," he said quietly. "I know that sounds like bullshit, but it's the truth. I was unhappy, but it wasn't because of you. I've been struggling for a long time, with work, with feeling like I wasn't living up to my own expectations. Rachel was an escape. A way to feel something other than failure." I listened, trying to make sense of his confession. Jake talked about how he'd felt trapped in a career he hated, how he'd been dealing with anxiety and depression but had been too ashamed to admit it. He described how he'd felt like a fraud, like he was constantly pretending to be someone he wasn't, and how the pressure to succeed had become suffocating. Rachel had been a distraction, someone who didn't know his baggage and didn't expect anything from him. It was the most vulnerable I'd ever seen him, but it didn't make the betrayal hurt any less. Just as I was about to end the conversation, Jake dropped a bombshell that I never saw coming. "There's something else you need to know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Rachel isn't just some random woman I met. She's my half-sister." My mind went blank, and for a moment, I thought I hadn't heard him correctly. "What?" I stammered, my heart racing. "What do you mean she's your half-sister?" Jake looked pained, running a hand through his hair. "I found out about her a few years ago. My dad had an affair before he left us, and Rachel was the result. I didn't know she existed until she reached out to me. We connected, and it was weird at first, but I wanted to know her. I just never thought it would turn into whatever this is." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Jake's affair hadn't just been infidelity, it was a twisted, tangled mess of family secrets and lies that went far beyond anything I could have imagined. My husband had cheated on me with his own sister, and he'd kept that secret buried deep, hoping it would never see the light of day. I stared at Jake, struggling to process the gravity of what he'd just told me. My mind flashed back to every moment of our relationship, the late nights, the laughter, the arguments, and suddenly, everything felt tainted. This wasn't just about a broken marriage, it was about a betrayal on a level I couldn't comprehend. Jake had shattered not just my trust, but my entire sense of reality. I left the cafe in a daze, unable to process what Jake had told me. It was like my entire world had been turned upside down, and I didn't know how to make sense of any of it. I was angry, disgusted, and heartbroken all at once. This was more than just a betrayal, it was a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. Update number 2, the aftermath and trying to make sense of it all. In the weeks that followed, I struggled to come to terms with everything Jake had revealed. I couldn't wrap my head around how he'd let things get so out of control, how he'd crossed lines that should never have been crossed. I felt lost, like my life had been shattered into a million pieces, and I didn't know how to put it back together. I cut off all contact with Jake, blocking his number and refusing to respond to his desperate attempts to explain himself. I couldn't bear to hear his voice, to be reminded of the twisted mess he'd made of our lives. I threw myself into therapy, trying to untangle the web of emotions that threatened to drown me. Dr. Collins was patient and kind, helping me navigate the overwhelming grief and anger that consumed me. I spent hours journaling, pouring out my thoughts in an attempt to make sense of the chaos. Some days, I was filled with rage, wanting to scream at the universe for letting this happen. Other days, I felt numb, like I was floating through life in a fog. I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone the full truth, I was too ashamed, too embarrassed by the sick, twisted reality of what had happened. Rachel reached out to me a few times, but I ignored her. I didn't know what to say to her, didn't know if I could ever face her again after everything that had come to light. She was just as much a victim of Jake's lies as I was, but it didn't make her betrayal hurt any less. I needed time, space, and distance to heal, and I wasn't sure when or if I'd ever be ready to confront her again. My friends tried to be supportive, but they didn't know the full extent of what had happened. I told them the basics, that Jake had cheated, that our marriage was over, but I left out the darker details. I wasn't ready to deal with the judgment, the pity, or the questions that would inevitably follow. I was barely keeping my head above water, and I couldn't handle anyone else's reactions on top of my own. One day, I got a call from Jake's mother, who had heard bits and pieces of what had happened. She was devastated, angry, and desperate for answers. She asked me how Jake could have done something so awful, how he could have thrown everything away. I didn't have the heart to tell her the whole truth, that her son had been involved with his own half-sister. It was a secret I wasn't sure I'd ever be able to share. I felt trapped in a web of lies and secrets that weren't mine to keep but that I couldn't escape. Every day was a battle to get through, and I felt like I was constantly teetering on the edge of a breakdown. I was angry at Jake for what he'd done, but I was also angry at myself for not seeing the signs, for not realizing that the man I loved and trusted was capable of something so monstrous. As the weeks turned into months, I slowly started to find my footing again. Therapy was a lifeline, helping me process the trauma and begin the long journey of healing. Dr. Collins encouraged me to focus on myself, to set small goals and take things one day at a time. I started going for long walks, rediscovering my love of writing, and reconnecting with friends I'd lost touch with. It wasn't easy, but each day felt like a small victory. I also started reading about other women who had been through infidelity, hoping to find some sense of solidarity in their stories. I joined online support groups, where I could vent and cry without fear of judgment. It helped to know that I wasn't alone, that other people had been through similar pain and had come out the other side. Their stories gave me hope that I could, too. One day, Rachel reached out to me again, this time with a long, heartfelt email. She apologized for everything, explaining how she'd been just as blindsided as I was by the revelation of their shared father. She'd been caught in the same web of lies, manipulated by Jake's charm and desperate for a connection she'd never had. She wasn't asking for forgiveness, just understanding. It was the first time I'd allowed myself to see Rachel as more than just the other woman. She was a victim, too, pulled into a situation that was beyond her control. I still felt hurt and betrayed, but I also felt a strange sense of kinship with her. We'd both been deceived, both been hurt by the same man, and in some twisted way, we were connected by our shared pain. I decided to meet Rachel one more time, this time on my terms. We met at a quiet park, sitting on a bench overlooking a small lake. She looked nervous, her eyes filled with remorse, but I could tell that she, too, was trying to move on. We talked for hours, sharing our stories, our anger, and our confusion. It was cathartic, and for the first time, I felt a sense of closure. Rachel told me about her struggles growing up without knowing her father, how meeting Jake had filled a void she hadn't even realized was there. She'd never intended to fall for him, and when she found out the truth, she'd felt just as trapped as I had. It didn't make what happened okay, but it gave me a deeper understanding of the tangled mess we were both trying to navigate. By the end of our conversation, I felt lighter, like a weight I'd been carrying for months had finally been lifted. I didn't forgive Rachel, and I wasn't sure if I ever would, but I no longer saw her as the enemy. We were both trying to heal, both trying to make sense of a situation that was beyond our control. Update number 3, moving forward and rebuilding my life. After my meeting with Rachel, I made a conscious decision to let go of the anger that had been consuming me. It wasn't easy, and some days were harder than others, but I knew that holding on to the pain would only keep me trapped in the past. I wanted to move forward, to rebuild my life on my own terms. I filed for divorce, determined to close the chapter of my life once and for all. Jake didn't contest it, knowing that there was no way to salvage what he destroyed. Our divorce was finalized quietly, without the drama I'd feared, and I felt a bittersweet mix of relief and sadness as I signed the papers. It was the end of an era, but also the beginning of something new. I threw myself into my writing, starting a blog where I shared my journey of healing and self-discovery. I wrote about the pain, the anger, and the small moments of joy that kept me going. My blog started gaining traction, and I received messages from women all over the world who'd been through similar experiences. It felt empowering to share my story, to connect with others who understood the complexities of betrayal and the resilience it took to move on. I also started dating again, cautiously dipping my toes back into the world of relationships. It was scary at first. I was terrified of getting hurt again, of opening myself up to the possibility of betrayal. But I knew that I couldn't let my past define my future. I went on a few casual dates, nothing serious, but it was enough to remind me that I was still capable of finding happiness. Jake reached out a few times, sending me messages filled with regret and apologies, but I kept my distance. I wasn't ready to forgive him, and I didn't owe him my forgiveness. I'd made peace with the fact that some wounds would never fully heal, and that was okay. I was focused on myself, on rebuilding a life that was mine and mine alone. I started to find joy in the little things again, taking a yoga class, baking cookies on a Sunday afternoon, or simply sitting in the sun with a good book. I reconnected with friends, started going to brunch again, and even took a solo trip to Italy, something I'd always dreamed of but never had the courage to do. It was liberating to explore the world on my own terms, to rediscover who I was outside of my marriage. Final update: finding peace and choosing myself. Hey Reddit, it's Emily again. It's been a year since I first found out about Jake's affair, and I wanted to give you all an update. I won't lie, this has been the hardest year of my life. I've faced heartbreak, betrayal, and some ugly truths that I never saw coming. But I've also found strength in places I didn't know existed, and I've learned that I am so much more than the worst things that have happened to me. Jake's betrayal cut me deeply, and the twisted reality of his affair with Rachel still haunts me sometimes. But I've made peace with the fact that I can't change the past. All I can do is focus on my future, on the things that bring me joy and the people who lift me up. I've reconnected with old friends, traveled to places I've always wanted to see, and started living life on my own terms. My writing has become my therapy, my outlet for all the emotions I can't always put into words. I've shared my story with thousands of readers, and their support has been a lifeline on days when I've felt lost. I've realized that I'm not alone, that my pain is shared by so many others, and that there's a kind of beauty in that collective resilience. As for Jake, I've let him go. I've let go of the anger, the hurt, and the desire for revenge. I'll never understand why he did what he did, but I've stopped trying to make sense of it. I've chosen to focus on myself, on the things I can control, and on the life I want to build moving forward. To anyone reading this who's been through something similar, just know that it's okay to feel broken. It's okay to grieve, to scream, to cry, and to question everything. But it's also okay to heal, to find joy, and to start over. You are stronger than you think, and you deserve happiness, even after the worst heartbreak. Thanks for being part of my journey. Here's to new beginnings, to finding peace, and to choosing ourselves, no matter what life throws our way.